On Thursday, we're going to be passing a bill that I consider every year to be the most significant bill of the year, and we know it's going to pass because it's passed every year since for the last 57 years. And it's going to pass. It's named the John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act, and I'm pleased that this conference report is a result of an open and bipartisan process. I got to thank, first of all, Chairman McCain and his staff for working so diligently and leading the legislation that bears his name. This year's NDAA is a fitting testament to his, and we're talking about John McCain's policies and his priorities and the lasting legacy on our nation. John was a true American hero, so it's appropriate that we name this bill after him. And I also want to thank Ranking Member Reid. Senator Reid has been by my side. The two of us have worked this defense authorization bill now for several months, and we've been very busy doing this, and we have been working closely with Chairman Thornberry over in the House, and then Ranking Member over there, Smith, for their hard work on this bill. You know, it always gets around to the big four after we all meet and we have the meetings with the House and the Senate, our joint conference meetings, but then there's always some things that need to be done, and they have to be done by the big four. I've been involved in several of these, and this year, of course, the chairman of the House committee and the acting chairman of the Senate committee and the ranking members worked very hard, and we got this done. So we should all be proud of this week's Defense Authorization Act, but shouldn't lose sight of why it's so important. We need to remember the degraded state of our military. You know, I don't mean this in a partisan way, but we had 8 years of the Obama administration, and I think that one thing that I've always appreciated about previously Senator Obama and then President Obama is that he is a real sincere, in-the-heart liberal. And quite often, the priorities of those individuals are not the same as they are of some of us, and particularly in a strong national defense. So we are really hurting. As of at the end of the Obama administration in 2016, only 33% of our brigade combat teams were ready at sufficient levels to be deployed. Only a quarter of our aviation brigades were ready, and just 40% of the Marines' F-18s were flyable. The Marines used the F-18s, only 40%, because the first thing somebody does when he's cutting down the expense of a strong military is do away with the maintenance, and that was the problem that we had. We were short 1,500 pilots. It had shrunk the force by nearly 100,000 service members, despite growing threats from around the world. I don't think anyone could really argue that this is a threatened world. I think it's the most threatened that our country has ever been in. We have countries around the world who have the capabilities of firing a rocket and hitting a city in America. That didn't used to be the case. You had to be a giant in order to be one of the leaders. Now we have people out there that we have to question their judgment, and they have this capability. So we've got a lot of things that we're supposed to do. We have fallen behind China and Russia. This year's National Defense Strategy for the first decade rightfully recognized that China and Russia are strategic adversaries and competitors. We're also falling behind, especially in technologies that would define the future of deterrence and capabilities. Look at hypersonic weapons. Hypersonic weapons are weapons that operate at 5 times the speed of sound. And it's still in the experimental stage. We're working on it, but we're behind China and Russia. They're both ahead of us at this time. The triad, the nuclear triad, it's a modernization program, and we have, over the 8 Obama years, didn't do anything in that, and consequently, during those years, China and Russia both passed us up. Long-range artillery. Artillery is measured by the rapid fire and by the range, and they, right now, in both cases of rapid fire and range, China and Russia are all ahead of us. The National Defense Strategy identified these vulnerabilities, but it's our responsibility to take that strategy and turn it into policy, and that's exactly what we're doing. This year's NDA does that. We're investing in training, maintenance, and modernization, restoring our qualitative and quantitative advantage around the world. I say restoring, not achieving, because we lost it. The chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff back in the, I think it was the 5th year of the Obama administration, said we are losing our qualitative and quantitative advantage around the world. It's kind of hard for people to conceive of this. You know, I'm used to the fact that most people believe, and probably still believe today, that the United States has the very best of everything, the best equipment. Well, we have the best troops and the best trained troops, but our equipment is not all that good. And so we are doing everything to try to change that. So that's the situation that we found our situation in. This year's NDAA will fully fund the key priorities we have identified that will ensure that our armed forces have the training, resources, and equipment that they need to complete their mission. And we fully fund what is needed to modernize the force, including procurement for aircraft, shipbuilding, and artillery. Procurement has always been a problem. It's been a problem since I was even serving in the House on the House Armed Services Committee. We're addressing this problem as it has not been addressed before. We have now fully funded in this bill the modernization of our nation's nuclear strategy, including the development of low-yield nuclear weapons and a layered missile defense. A lot of people don't realize that China, actually Russia, had a low-yield nuclear weapons, and we didn't. So we're trying to catch up in those areas. We fully funded support for critical allies and partners, including the Afghanistan security forces, the coalition support, Iraqi and security forces in Israel. So we've increased in strength to align with the President's budget request and adopt the growing threats from around the world. Now, this sounds easy, but it's not, because we're starting from behind. The NDAA that we're going to be voting on, we're talking about the bill we're going to vote on Thursday, goes beyond the President's request to provide greater funding for research and development, ensuring that we can continue to focus on new and emerging threats like hypersonics, space, and artillery. We're standing up to China by strengthening our position across the Pacific region. The bill provides support to our allies who stand up against China's military and economic coercion, and procures deployment air-based systems to enhance credibility and combat power. The NDAA also calls out China for illegally creating and fortifying islands in the South China Sea. I was in the South China Sea about a month ago, and when we talked to our allies there, they're all kind of looking at us and looking at China and wondering whose side do we want to be on, because all they see is what's happening in China. Those islands, those are illegal islands. They don't own the land under them, and yet the islands, there are some 7 different islands exceeding 3,000 acres that are as if they're preparing for World War III. And so we know what the capability is, we know what the problems are, and then of course there's Russia. It's growing aggression and influence across Eastern Europe by directing a study on permanently stationing U.S. Forces in Poland and conducting a study on Russians' malign influence around the world. Now that's in this bill. So we are actually going to take some action. It wasn't long ago, I think it was in March, that RAND Corporation, R-A-N-D, RAND Corporation is a corporation that makes assessments as to what our capabilities are, and they actually said that Russia is to the point right now that if they were to take on NATO, including our forces in NATO in Western Europe, that they would win. Now that's a pretty frightening thought. And it continues, the bill continues limitations on U.S.-Russia military cooperation, provides defensive lethal aid to Ukraine. I happened to be in Ukraine and I was with President Poroshenko way back when they had their parliamentary elections. I think it's about 4 years ago. And at that time, it's the first time they've had a parliamentary election in the Ukraine where there is not one communist in the Ukraine parliament now. And he was very, very proud. And of course, that upset Russia, and Putin started sending people into Ukraine and killing them. And our president at that time, President Obama, would not allow us to send some defensive weapons in there to help them. So it keeps pace with our troops. We're providing a military pay increase, and it's the first one, incidentally, in about 10 years. And it's modernizing officer personnel system and supporting our troops and military families. So when Senator Reid and I started on this process, we shared a commitment to making sure this year's NDAA is more than just another piece of legislation. Rather, it is a message to each and every one of our service members, and we did that. The NDAA tells them that they are our top priority. It is what we have to do to defend America. After all, the number one thing that we should be doing around here is defending America. A lot of people have forgotten that there's an old document around that nobody reads anymore. It's called a Constitution. In the Constitution, it says what we are supposed to be doing, defending America. And so I'm proud to say we did that. Every soldier, sailor, airman, Marine can look at this legislation and know that we have the support and commitment, and they have that support and commitment also of their country. So, Mr. President, I also want to speak just for a minute about the historic significance of this legislation, because the history of the National Defense Authorization Act is a distinguished one. As I mentioned before, we've passed this for 57 consecutive years. This is the 58th year. But what's unique is the fact that we are passing the legislation this week, a record of how quickly in the year it will be passed and signed into law. This was deliberate. We're moving quickly, but we're thorough, considering hundreds of bipartisan amendments in both the committee markup and on the floor. This will be the earliest NDAA has passed since 1996, when we were considering the legislation for fiscal year 1997. So it's a result of legislative process working. We set a budget in February and are authorizing the funding well in advance of next year's fiscal year. So now we can and should turn our attention to passing the necessary appropriations bill on time that aligns with that which we are authorizing today. I remember about 5 years ago, we went all the way into December before we passed this bill. And to remind you, if we don't get it done by the end of December, then that means that we're not going to get flight pay, not going to get hazard pay for our troops over there standing in harm's way. So we've done a good job on this. I'm anxious to get this out of the way, to vote it into law, which is going to take place on Thursday. And you have to remember that without consistent continued funding, the critical reforms in this year's NDAA will not be possible, and we won't be able to make the needed investments to restore our competitive advantage to China and Russia. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to restore what we have lost in this bill. It's all happening in this bill. So I think we'll have a chance on Thursday to vote for what I consider to be the most significant piece of legislation each year. With that, I yield the floor.